Hi students, I am losing the light out here tonight, but I wanted to do a very quick talk as we get into the specifics of totalitarian dictatorships. So one thing that I love about your textbook is that at the beginning of this chapter on dictatorships and war, it does a great job of discussing the difference between conservative authoritarianism and totalitarian radical dictatorship. And I think it's an important distinction for us to make, and so I want to do that with you real quickly to make sure everybody's got this down. So we've been talking about authoritarian regimes or nations for a while now in European history. If you want to look at a couple examples of these, you could look at, first of all, the regime of Metternich. Right? Remember when we were talking about Metternich and he was a conservative, right? But he was also an authoritarian. In other words, Metternich said, you have to watch out for ideas because they leap over gates, right? He repressed the freedom of the press because he did not want there to be new ideas coming into Austria. To Metternich, new ideas, whether they be classical liberalism or nationalism or socialism, were all bad things, and hanging on to the old way of life was a good thing. And so mercantilism needed to stay, Austrian tradition needed to stay, Catholicism needed to stay, and he would do what he could to repress new ideas. And if that meant that socialists needed to be jailed or kicked out of Austria, or classical liberals needed to be repressed, Metternich didn't see anything wrong with doing that, certainly. Okay, another example that your text gives is Catherine the Great of Russia. If you remember Catherine the Great, she was kind of a person of desperate means, right? Most people think that she had her husband killed so that she could take the throne with some political insiders. But what Catherine the Great wanted to do was to build a great modern Russia. And she did that, but it was at the cost of some freedoms for people, some intellectual freedoms, and of total obedience to her. So when you think about a Metternich or a Catherine the Great, or even a very powerful monarch like Louis XIV, certainly they are people who we think of synonymously with power. But why do we call Metternich or Catherine the Great's nations those of conservative authoritarianism? In other words, they were conservative in the old ways and they did not want to see mass change. They did not believe in social mobility. They did not want to see peasant revolts. They put things down when necessary, like Catherine and Pugachev's rebellion. They severely repressed the press when necessary. But what is the difference between them and, let's say, a modern radical totalitarian dictator? Well, some of it is goal and some of it is opportunity. So let's look at some modern radical totalitarian dictators and see if we can see any difference between, number one, the goal of modern dictatorships, and two, the opportunity that they had to carry this out because of what was available to them. So taking a look, this is a Nazi mass rally, and you're going to see several pictures here in a row of mass rallies that are familiar to us when we look at old footage, war footage, when we look at footage of the 1930s, which is the time when this type of mass rally response to a dictator, to a Führer, to a leader is kind of crystallizing. But here you see the organization of, massive amounts of people. You see kind of what we would call cultic practice, something that looks a little bit religious, something that involves a national unity. Hitler would have a lot of mass rallies that would be conducted, and he used the power of the mass rally throughout his time in Nazi Germany. One of the times that was the biggest time for there to be mass demonstrations of Nazi socialism was on his birthday. And he used his birthday as a time to unite the party, the Nazi party, and its goals to him personally. And so there were always mass rallies conducted on Hitler's birthday. And they were great demonstrations of Nazi unity, power, leadership. Stalin also took advantage of the mass rally. And so here we can see, right, lots of workers. You can look and see the way that they're dressed in a similar fashion, and all holding these posters of Stalin conveniently supplied by Stalin's administration, and red flags waving in the background, right? So certainly Stalin also took advantage of this idea of getting the masses to appreciate and to express their admiration for their dear leaders. Here we have Mussolini. Now, Mussolini's going to look different depending on what phase he's in. And when we get into the details of Italian fascism and Mussolini's leadership, you'll know why, because he kind of started one way and ended up another. But Mussolini also used the power of the mass rally in Italy to get these adoring crowds to acknowledge him and his party leadership as the central thing to follow in Italy. We'll see as we get into detail that Mussolini was a little bit less effective at actually creating a totalitarian dictatorship versus Stalin and Hitler, who were very effective in what they did. But nonetheless, they all wanted the same thing. Now, what is it that these people are calling out and calling to that's different than, let's say, Metternich or Catherine the Great? Well, your text does a great job of pointing out that what these people wanted was not just to repress freedom, but they wanted total control, thus the word totalitarian. They're looking for total control, not just politically, but economically, also socially, culturally, religiously. This comes down to the bearing of children, marriage. It comes down to reading material. It comes down to what you're allowed to wear in some places. What's the preferred look in this totalitarian regime? What radio shows you're allowed to listen to? What is the prevailing kind of material that you should read, and in some places even what kind of vacations you should go on in order to show that you get what's happening in your particular dictatorship. We'll get to that a little bit in Germany and Italy. But this is an interesting idea because radical totalitarian dictators almost always rule by force. They almost always take over by force, as you see happened with the Russian communists. But in Hitler's case, of course, he was elected chancellor. Certainly, he had a military-esque rule over the people. He kept control of the military, and he took control not only by legal means, but then by the use of the black shirts and brown shirts, small elite forces that he used not only to take over, but to eliminate each other, and we'll talk more about that in the German lecture. So certainly Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler all used the appeal of the mass rally, and they all wanted the same thing, which is total control over the power. We're back. Okay. So as I was saying, imagine radioing your mass message for your people into the midst of their homes on radio. Access that the leader has, that's free access that everyone's tuning into, especially in times of desperation, in times of economic crisis, in times of political crisis. People are looking for answers, and the mass leaders, the dictators, the totalitarian radicals, they can provide this, and they can provide it through radio waves. So this picture of Stalin shows an example of the radical totalitarian dictatorships in terms of just painting the leader as a pensive, caring figure, personality that's overlooking or thinking through the greatness of Russia, the greatness of the people, what he can do for the average Russian. It would not be unusual for people in a radical totalitarian dictatorship to have pictures of the leader in their home. Now, some people hated the radical totalitarian dictators. Once they lived under their brutality, they did not agree. But there were people who lived in this era that believed that they were doing the best that was possible, and that Stalin was this dear father figure. I'm going to show you some more of this as we get into Russia. But one thing that I want you to note is that for a radical totalitarian, there's things that must be replaced by the leader, okay? You cannot have a separate religious influence in your life. Always want to get rid of any kind of religious allegiance. And so you see this, and it's kind of interesting, guys, whether the dictatorship promotes religion in some certain way or tries to stamp it out. So in other words, the difference between Hitler, who co-opted a lot of Lutheran pastors, not all, but he got Lutheran pastors to submit to the Nazi dictatorship and to preach a pro-Nazi version of their theology and their sermons, where their things were checked through by the Nazi government, and they worked in a cooperation with the oppression. Whether you're talking about Stalin, who seeks to repress religious expression, or you're talking about Mussolini, who makes deals with the Catholic Church and only deals with those who are willing to suffer underneath his version of Catholicism, which is a politicized Catholicism that he is controlling and he is marketing and he has people dedicated to. So, and Mussolini somewhat failed at totalitarianism, and that's partially directed to the strong, true Catholicism that was in Italy. So when we think about the allegiance that these people demand, it cannot be allegiance to anything else. Now, if you're keeping up with current events, the big story right now is whether or not the leader of North Korea, a modern radical totalitarian dictatorship, whether or not the leader Kim Jong-un is dead, brain dead, whether or not he is alive. And at least by early this afternoon, there was still a question mark about where he was. And, why would we not know the answer to that? Well, traditionally, the North Koreans have kept the deaths of their leaders secret for 4 days to a week, and oftentimes tried to buy time as they developed a narrative about what really happened, a narrative about who the next leader is going to be. There's been a lot of speculation about Kim Jong-un's sister taking over for him right now. But nonetheless, there's a lot of repression of the people, and there's different stories coming out of Japan, South Korea. The North Koreans refuse to comment and say that everything is fine when they do comment. And North Korea is a great example of a modern repressive regime in so many ways. I'm going to put a link up to a documentary that is on the North Korean mass games. It is got to be one of my favorite documentaries, and it really helps to explore the totalitarian mentality, the forced unity, even in a modern day dictatorship like North Korea. I'd really encourage you to watch the whole entire documentary. But if you can't do that, or you can't find it, I think it's just on YouTube. I'm going to give you a 4.5-minute link. I'd really like you to watch it. It's a real documentary about something that really happens in North Korea, where these mass games are performed by the children and adults of North Korea in honor to their leader. And the whole idea is that their individual consciousness, personality is subjected to the total, is subjected to this idea of putting yourself aside and just performing in mass in front of the leader of your totalitarian dictatorship. It's a really great film to watch. Something that I showed my girls a lot as they were growing up. It was one of those things that we kind of returned to. So I hope that you'll get a chance to watch it. But if nothing else, watch the clip, and I will see you as we talk about each of these three regimes in more detail and take quizzes on them. All right.